I wanted to begin my questions with a comment that you made in your opening statement about some of the difficulties with deploying broadband and being able to partner with private entities. And I would point out that I have a bill with Senators Cardin and Graham. We call it the e-bridge effort. And the good news, this will, I think, address some of those issues. There's really no controversy on it, and it is on suspension in the House today. So we're hoping that that gets through the House of Representatives, and that provides you that flexibility. Because as you know, all of these things are great, but if we can't get the broadband into those more rural areas or those that are disadvantaged, they just become more and more disadvantaged. I want to ask about the $3 billion that was released through the American Rescue Plan. As you've said, was divided into 6 programs. One of them is the Build Back Better. You said had 529 applications?
529, correct.
Yeah. I know 10 of them are really good because they're from the state of West Virginia. And maybe we'll give Mr. Whitehair a chance to talk about his. But you're taking a regional approach there, which is different than the way the 1.5 was distributed in the CARES Act. And I guess I'm wondering, why did you decide to deviate from a traditional approach and go more regional for these Build Back Better? And also, what is the timeline to have those? I know they're in phase 1 now, and you just got those applications, but when do you anticipate those decisions being made? Because obviously it's going to be very competitive. Because
Yes.
you're only going to grant, it says 50 to 60.
So let me just answer the first part of the question with regard to why did we deviate. This was as I mentioned in my opening statement, a historic infusion of
Right.
of resources for EDA. We wanted to make sure that we had investments that were truly transformational. And we also wanted to make sure that regions weren't competing against one another. Hence why we were making sure that there was partnership. I usually say that the secret sauce of this grant was really bring as many partners to the table so that our investments from the federal government could be supplemented in many ways with private sector investment, the technical skills, the talent, and make the programs work in a grander scale. As I referenced earlier, the one-offs is not what's going to create the type of economic development that we need. And it's been interesting, Senator, to see just not only the appetite, the response, and the excitement for regional economic development. Going back to reauthorization, this is the evolution of EDA, not just localities, but looking at truly regional economic development, collaboration, and partnership.
Well, I know that our regional EDAs have been doing this kind of thing for years, smaller. Maybe this is encourage more of them to get together. The last question I had was, after the phase 1 gets in, what is your timeline?
We're expecting within the next few months to be able to get into the phase 2 approach.
Okay.
Right now, we're evaluating all of the 529 and making sure that we're making those decisions.
You've mentioned in your testimony too that you would want to have in a reauthorization an update of distress priorities, new updated priorities. I guess, and then you mentioned, communities of color and equity and others, disadvantaged communities. I would imagine these would be enhancements to what were the traditional way that EDA would assess a distressed community, because distress is distress. I mean, could you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Currently, our distress definition is per capita income, unemployment, but we know that communities have different factors that come into play. Whether it's rural communities being remote, looking at sometimes the age of the infrastructure of a community could also be an indicator. What we're looking for, and you mentioned it in your comments, Senator, is providing flexibility on how we determine that distress component. And as I mentioned before, distress is very tied to our grant rates, how we determine how much match is required in a community. So we want to make sure that we're accurately depicting what distress looks like community by community.
Okay, good. Also, we've run into this a couple times. EDA maintains an interest in real property acquired, constructed, or improved with agency funds for the estimated useful life of the project. Well, things change, and different properties might want to get repurposed for different reasons that might be more useful to the community. Are you finding that this is a nationwide issue? Is this something that should be addressed in a reauthorization piece so that we can have the flexibility to work with EDA to make that repurposing easier and more seamless?
We find areas where we have those situations, and we work closely with the grantee through our regional offices. This is an area that I very much would welcome working with your team to make sure that we either best understand and assess how to address it. As you well pointed out, conditions change.
Yeah, Senator Cardin and I have looked at this issue, and we have a bill out, the Reinvigorating Lending for the Future Act, and I think this might help give you some of that flexibility, which I think would be very, very beneficial. Thank you. And I want to thank the witnesses again. I want to start with Mr. Whitehair. I know in working with projects throughout the state of West Virginia with the regional development, economic development councils has been really, really good. But I also know there's frustration. There's frustration that you can't get awarded, it doesn't meet the criteria, and then I think people get discouraged because they get rejected by EDA. And, can you kind of get into that a little bit and how we could improve that? I mean, you mentioned more capacity so that you could help other people with their applications. Is it, what's the hang up sometimes on these kinds of things?
Well, good question, Senator. Thank you for that. I think one of the struggles we have in West Virginia is the local match requirement. A lot of these small rural communities just don't have the resources. And for that matter, there may be a state funding program that we can't necessarily match or fund that it goes with the initiative that we're trying to get awarded. So one of the major issues that we have is trying to come up with the required match commitment that's part of EDA's statute. Now, if there's a way to possibly, and I know, the assistance to coal communities, there's an 80-20, they kind of, were flexible with lowering the match requirement, but I think those guidelines that are used today are kind of maybe a little bit outdated, maybe need to be looked at again to see if there's a way to lower the local commitment that's required for these projects, because these projects, not only are they becoming more difficult, but they're getting more expensive.
Right.
So those local match dollars increase as those costs go up. So it's definitely a prohibitive factor in pursuing or trying to get EDA funds.
What about the metrics of the project? I think we've been through this too in West Virginia, where one of the reasons that we were maybe not getting as many EDA grants as we would have not just liked, but maybe deserved, is that quantifying the job, not just how many it's going to create, but how many it's going to save. And, when you're in a rural area, your numbers just quite naturally are not going to be as high and as impactful, even though, as you explained with the situation in Elkins with that distribution center that I was happy to go to the ribbon cutting for, and the one in Barber County as well. Has EDA shown some flexibility there? Do we need to give them more flexibility in the statute? Do you have any opinion on that?
Yes.
And is that a real problem?
Yeah, that is a good question, and a problem that we kind of experience in my region. We, sometimes these projects that we're trying to get funded, sometimes not necessarily don't require or trying to recruit this 200-400 job business to come to the area. It's mostly, more often than not, we're trying to retain what we have.
Right.
So, we have to get a little creative sometimes in getting some documentation to justify the need, and that requires getting all these retention numbers to kind of, I guess, show that the investment is there for EDA to consider. Sometimes there only may be a dozen or two jobs that are going to be created, but it's more of an impact for our communities to retain what we have. So we kind of try to be creative in selling our project in that way.
Thank you. I mean, I think as we're looking at reauthorization, I think not only, and I agree with what Mr. Bowman is saying, you got to look forward into what the jobs of the future are, and also how you can use technology to be much more efficient. We got to remove some of these barriers that are systemic. They've been there for years, and as much as Tracy Rowan and you want to work together, and she's great, by the way.
Yep.
She's our state representative, to try to overcome these barriers. Sometimes it's just impossible, and then you kind of give up. I don't know. I'd like to give the other two witnesses in the room here, if you have, because you've been through this before, if you've experienced the same kinds of things, Mr. Bowman, in Delaware.
Yes, I completely agree. There's a lot of issues that get in the way of equity, whether it's rural or urban, underserved communities and so forth. And to your point about jobs saved or jobs created, for example, another job I have is state director of the Small Business Development Center, and the SBA has metrics there, and the SBA metrics do include both. That is, new jobs created and jobs saved. That may be transformational in technology, what has to happen there to do that. And it's not just the same old thing. It's not about that kind of money. It's about trying to retain an industry that has merit, but has to change or it won't stay anymore. We went through that with automotive industries. We lost 2 complete automotive assembly plants. That was a core to Delaware. That was 15,000 jobs, and they flat went down. What do you do with that? Well, one, we turned into a massive research park now with multi-tenants, and some are industrial, some are clean energy, some are academic units. The second one, believe it or not, Amazon came along and made the biggest warehouse distribution center you can imagine. 4 million square feet, several layers high. Now, where did that come from? Well, you work it and you work it and you work it. And so a lot of those people came back to work with the help of community college education, retraining, certification. Software is a big problem in Delaware because we're a financial services state. Well, there's a program called Zip Code, which is almost all minority. 8th grade's fine. We'll teach you how to do software. JP Morgan Chase says, you graduate with a certificate, we'll hire every one of them. And that's what's happened. So there are programs like that. They're kind of organic. Some are experimental. Obviously, some don't make it. But you have to try things. And I think looking laterally, not just vertically, is kind of the way to do that.
If you don't mind, I'm going to ask Mr. Lehman if you have a comment on that.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Two comments briefly. First, North Dakota is very unique in that it has the highest labor participation rate in the country, but it also has the highest productivity per labor unit. And so we don't have much flexibility in terms of finding new workforce. So we kind of have the opposite issue as many places in terms of we need the workforce because we have too many open jobs. Like, for example, an Amazon facility recently opened, and it has by far the lowest labor participation for any Amazon facility in the United States that is opened. So going back to the equity issue, even though North Dakota is a very small populated state, we do have some urban areas that have creative ideas. There are businesses, I was speaking with Senator Kramer, that want to convert old facilities into housing and create the transportation network as well as English language training and a number of daycare, because that's obviously an issue. But again, the match constraints for private industry, they can only handle so many millions of dollars when they're medium-sized manufacturing firms, which would promote a pipeline of workforce, which would then create, from an equity and inclusion perspective, economic opportunity that's long-standing and long-term for communities that decide to make North Dakota home, or for groups that decide to make North Dakota home. On the flip side of that, going back to the coal example, being capped at $5 million when we have the opportunity today to literally take our coal, utilize it for fertilizer creation in a clean way, store the carbon, but also create energy that the rest of the world wants in terms of hydrogen and other clean mechanisms. The area where the EDA can help out the most in that area would be in DevEx, or development expenditures, meaning we can find private capital, we can find projects, but nobody wants to pay for the development, the engineering, permitting, et cetera. This is the problem every economic developer has in the country.
Front side.
And so if the EDA could step up in that area or from a programmatic perspective, that would really help communities rapidly transition into the next generation in terms of utilizing their natural resources for the benefit of the United States.